And now we divert into what I refer to as the hippy-dippy part of the lecture. And it's something that I've taught in many classes, and it's really difficult, and I can spend an entire class doing it. But it actually comes out of being able to look at things like a writer. And that's that literature has had a very large influence. Dr. Cho has actually taken 30 units in the humanities when he was an undergraduate. And the thing he learned from it is what literature is about is taking a whole bunch of little details and seeing how it all fits together. And when you find out how it all fits together, that's the truth. And you do exactly the same thing in marketing. It's about getting all these pieces of evidence together to figure out what is it that derives into the product or the truth of what it is you need to offer. And so the nature of things is when you're able to look at something at its detail, from its finest detail to its overall vision, then that's where you find opportunity. Steve Jobs realized that technology by itself is kind of frightening. And so he was always about marrying your emotion to technology. And by that, he basically makes you emotionally connected to your product so they can grossly overcharge you. But anyway, that's what he said his life was about, is marrying the two. And so the nature of something is we're all made up of many different things. And when you look at a process of what people do, it's many parts. And so what maybe one little part is where all the value is. Maybe it's a collection of things. But by understanding how they've been derived and how they interact together, that's where you can find your customer's value. And this is also the nature of problem solving. So products can have more than one value. And you can lock into that. And if you look at good products, they have a lot of depth. They do more than one thing. And the other thing you find is secondary values can all of a sudden have primary values. This is why entrepreneurs pivot into different things. Great design is a confluence of function and art. It has more than one meaning. For example, this is a picture of MIT. MIT is known for its domes and pillars. And so this is where the entrance of MIT looks like. And as you can see, it's extremely powerful. And so, yes, it's a functional building, but at the same time, the aesthetic gives it a sense of strength. This is Dr. Cho's dormitory at MIT. Besides being an unusual curved building, it has more than just architectural curiosity. The front of my dorm faced the Charles River, and so what Alvar Aalto, the architect, was trying to do was actually create more surface area, so you'd have more rooms that had a view of the river, and that's why he made it that way. This is Princeton University's chapel. Now, besides being a piece of art, those long windows, it gives it a sense of height. But not only that, those long windows are functional. They bring in a lot of light into the chapel. And so as you could see, it was more than just art they were shooting for, functionality. There could be more than one meaning to something. And so I'll wrap up this little artistic part with this photograph. Even though the large scale of a city behind it, it's those small lights make the person seem bigger. The person also stands out because all the lines are either horizontal or vertical, and that person is diagonal. And as you can see, the lighting and everything else, it creates meaning to it. And so small things, how they fit into larger things, this is called leveling up, being able to look at things in different ways. An example is Southwest Airlines. And that Southwest, what they did is they broke with tradition, that having meals and flying through hubs and things like that, they got rid of. And everybody thought that was going to be a big deal. And it wasn't. And so they revolutionized the business. And the secondary points of just giving you peanuts instead of a meal and everything else, those things held up. But were they really revolutionary? Well, no. What Southwest recognized is that if you're going to short points, and this is the context, if it's a short flight, you don't need a meal. If it's a short flight, you want to go point to point. You don't want to go through a hub. And so what Southwest originally was designed for was short flights. Now, what happened when Southwest started going to long flights? They started having hubs. They started offering box meals. They told you to, buy a meal before you get on the plane, and so on and so forth. And so they actually started becoming more and more like the traditional airline. And the traditional airlines, there was a good reason why they did the things that they did. Okay, what is context? Context are those macro forces in the world that shapes our decision making. And they take the form of one of these factors, whether it's social, technological. Some examples of context is international. Here in the United States, electric cars aren't a necessity. They're still more of a curiosity. However, in places like China and India, places with air quality problems and not a lot of cars, there's a lot more going on over there in terms of electric cars than here. They value it more. So internationally, not only that, but a big opportunity for people overseas is a lot of these emerging nations don't have all the things we have here. So those services and products that we take for granted are actually very valued across the ocean. And so a lot of people go overseas to sell their goods. Are there social shifts? For example, nobody recycled 35 years ago. Now everybody does. What does the government do? If the laws change, you could take advantage of it. What's the background economic situation? When 2007 the Black Swan hit, it was really tough on entrepreneurs and small businesses because there was no money. And of course, technology can have a huge, huge impact in what it is you can do and can't do. Examples, if you look at computers started out as geek instruments, and then they became communication instruments, and now they're social instruments. And essentially what they've done is they've become our portal to everything. It's just commonplace. And somebody like Ken Olsen-Adek couldn't believe that anybody would want a computer in their home. And that decision killed his company. In terms of context, your competition tends to be myopic. This is something, kind of context you can take advantage of. And in an age of innovation, you have to be constantly getting better. When you slow down and stop, that's where you get hurt. But the thing that tends to limit companies are their biases, and that's why you need to have multiple views and be able to look at a larger picture. An example is, and this is actually your discussion question, shoe salesman in the Outback calls his office and says, "This is a terrible market. Nobody wears shoes." His competitor calls the office and said, "This is a great market. No one wears shoes." So who's right? Another example of lack of vision, and this has to do with seeing that there's more than one value to a product, and being able to spend and looking at more than one value. And that's that watches traditionally were pieces for either the very wealthy or just to keep time. And so they thought the watch business had plateaued. And then a little town in Switzerland said, "Hey, let's take advantage of technology," that there were good plastics coming out. And they realized a watch was actually also a fashion piece. And what was this company? Swatch. They totally revolutionized the fashion industry. U.S. Steel collapsed because overseas they could process steel a lot more easily. And so companies like U.S. Steel started selling out parts and getting into other businesses because they thought this was the end. Well, again, if you look at steel from the viewpoint, the value of only producing it, ultimately the real value is what's the cost of steel. And what happened is a little company called Nucor Steel realized, hey, they can make it cheaper than we can, but they have to take that steel across an ocean, billions of tons. That can't be cheap. And so what they started doing is they figured out that there were a few prime centers in the United States that were steel consumers. And so they built little mini mills. These little mini mills were cheap to set up, and the distances were close to where they needed to deliver the steel. And so they became very profitable that way. And in the final part of this lecture, I will talk about the value chain.